Okay, well, could I just welcome all of you here, and thanks to those of you who braved the extremely inclement conditions out there, and I'm conscious it's also the last teaching week of term, so I know it's a busy time for everyone, but I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this important event being hosted by the School of Social Sciences and Philosophy and the Athena Swan Initiative within the school as well, and to have such a great panel of speakers with us on such a hot topic, if I may say so, the topic of positive action initiatives, precedents, lessons and remedies. So it's very timely. We will be, I think it's being podcast, am I right? Yes, so there will be a wider audience than the people present here tonight as well. So my name is Ivana Bacik. I lecture part-time now in the School of Law, and I'm also a senator. And I'm also chairing the Law School's Athena Swan Initiative. So I have a really strong interest in the Athena Swan process. I was just going to say a few words about that before I invite our speakers, and to say something more generally about positive action measures. So first of all, I think you'll probably all be aware of Athena Swan. It is, of course, the gender equality benchmarking process that was commenced in Britain and has only more recently, in the last 4 years, come to Ireland for all third-level institutions. There's now, I think, 31 awards, Athena Swan awards, made across this jurisdiction, all at bronze level. So there's 3 levels: bronze, silver and gold. And institutions like Trinity, or indeed sub-units within institutions like faculties or indeed schools, may each individually apply for an Athena Swan award. It's a rigorous process, as I know from the inside, as Francis knows and many others know. It's a rigorous process, and it involves having to look at both quantitative and qualitative data as to gender equality, but also intersectional issues around, for example, sexuality, trans, ethnicity, class, in your school or your unit, or indeed your whole institution, and then to identify issues that arise for equality, and then to also devise an action plan to address those issues. I should say it began as again you'll be aware, as a STEM related initiative in the sciences and engineering and so on, what I as a law student and my colleagues used to call the other end of college, but which perhaps an unfortunate phrase, but which of course has now been extended to the entirety of the disciplines across faculties in all universities and colleges. So it's a very important initiative. We'll all be aware also that Minister Mary Mitchell-O'Connor has announced a tying of that with funding, so that there's going to be regard had to gender equality standards in funding. And of course there's also recently been the announcement, as we know, for the specific positions, targeted positions in areas where, lecturing positions in areas where there is an underrepresentation of men or indeed of women, and where no other action has been shown to be effective in tackling that underrepresentation. So those they've been termed the women-only professorships, and they have been advanced as well as a way of trying to address this ongoing issue of lack of women in senior positions across most disciplines in universities and colleges. And of course we'll all be aware that there's never been a woman head of a university in Ireland to date, and that despite at least equal numbers of women and men as students, we still don't see women trickling up. There's that sort of trickle up fallacy. My good friend and colleague Professor Eileen Drew calls it the trickle up fallacy. Hasn't actually had effect. So it's an area I have a huge interest in, just to finish, not just in my role as Athena Swan convener, but also as a legislator, as somebody who drafted the Justice Committee's report back in 2009 in the Oireachtas on the need for positive action within politics to address serious underrepresentation of women in the Dáil. As a result of our report, we saw gender quota legislation introduced in 2012 requiring political parties to select at least 30% of their candidates of each gender. So it's a law we had recommended, modelled on a Belgian initiative that had a real and seriously progressive impact there. We saw that law come into effect in Ireland for the first time in the 2016 general election, And lo and behold, our figures of women TDs, which had remained stagnant for many decades, rose from a high previously of about 14% to a new high of 22% of our women TDs. So just over 1 in 5 of our TDs are women, 35 out of 158. Still far too low, but significant progress on what had gone before. The quota rises to 40% in the election after next. All the political parties are seriously committed, because they lose half their state funding if they don't comply. There's a carrot and a big stick, and but it's already been seen to have effect, and it's seen generally, despite having been somewhat controversial when we first recommended it in 2009. It's now seen as very much a positive thing within the political system, and I think that's a good model for elsewhere. I was listening to a speech by on Taoiseach yesterday, Leah Radker, obviously a Trinity graduate, speaking very passionately about spreading positive action messages across, for example, boards. There are still companies quoted in the Irish Stock Exchange with no women members of the board, so there's a state boards much better because positive action targets were introduced. So we see positive action taking effect, addressing and tackling pre-existing inequalities and bringing women forward and tackling that trickle-up fallacy. So I've talked for far too long, and now I'm going to hand over to our panel. They're going to speak for 10 minutes each, or up to 12. We have strict timekeeping, and then we'll have a question and answer and general discussion for the floor. We will be finished by 7:30 at the latest, so you can just so you know the finish time. And I just want to introduce each in turn, and we're delighted to have a range of perspectives from different disciplines. First, Professor Elaine Moriarty, who's from the sociology area, assistant professor in sociology, and her teaching and research interests include mobility, migration, employment and labour markets, qualitative research methods, and race and ethnicity. So Elaine is extremely well placed to speak with us about the intersectional issues of equality. We'll then be hearing from Alejandra Ramos, if I've pronounced your name right, Alejandra. My name's always mispronounced, so I know what it feels like. Assistant professor at the Department of Economics here in Trinity, and an applied microeconomist, with a focus on development, and her research interests are intra-household decision-making, intimate partner violence and education. So again, very interesting and very different discipline. Then thirdly, we'll hear from Lisa Keenan, a teaching fellow at the Department of Political Science, who was awarded a Grattan Scholarship in 2013. She will speak further about women in politics, because that's her research interest, and I've heard Lisa speak on that before as an excellent speaker. Her research examined potential sites of resistance to women's participation in political life, both before and after that key selection moment where people are selected as candidates. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Adina Preda, who is an associate professor in philosophy here, who is leading a 5-year research project in political philosophy called Real, Rights and Egalitarianism, founded by the ERC with a consolidator grant. And the project aims to demonstrate that egalitarian policies are compatible with a commitment to individual rights. And so we're going to hear great presentations from each of the four, and certainly I'm, as a mere lawyer, really looking forward to learning from colleagues in those very different other disciplines. So we'll ask Elaine first to come up and to give a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. So on the 21st of June 2019, Minister of State with Special Responsibility for Higher Education, Mary Mitchell O'Connor, announced the opening of a call for applications to the Senior Academic Leadership Initiative, described as a targeted positive action initiative which aims to accelerate gender balance at senior positions in Irish higher education institutions. In this short talk, I will specifically look at the Senior Academic Leadership Initiative with the unfortunate acronym SALI. I will briefly outline the context of this more directive strategy around gender equality in higher education by the government. I will briefly look at some positive action initiatives that have been utilised in other European higher education institutions before raising a couple of concerns and considerations that some academics have made on the issue of gender-specific positions and positive action in general. So the SALI initiative, the background is comprehensive. There were a wide range of reviews, expert bodies, task forces. I'll refer to but a couple of those here. The HEA National Review of Gender Equality in Higher Education Institutions 2016 identified serious issues with gender inequality at senior academic levels in higher education institutions. The HEA Higher Education Institutional Staff by Gender Report 2018 showed that in 2017, 24% of professor posts were held by women, compared to 51% women lecturers. While the HEA expert group recommended that HEIs adopt a flexible cascade model, whereby the proportion of men and women to be recruited or promoted to a certain level is based on the proportion of each at the career level directly below, the Gender Equality Task Force deemed this approach too slow to have a meaningful impact on gender equality in higher education. Analysis had shown that using the flexible cascade model, it could take up to 20 years to reach gender equality at professorial level in the higher education institutions. That is a minimum of 40% female professors. So the task force recommended that HEIs introduced a, quote, suite of initiatives to bring about sustainable organizational change and to empower a culture of gender equality in higher education institutions. So along with the establishment of a Centre of Excellence for Gender Equality in the HEA, all higher education institutions were required to engage in the Athena Swan accreditation process, to develop gender and diversity statements, and to nominate and achieve specific targets for what was described as proportionate gender representation at all levels of seniority in higher education institutions. Importantly, as Ivana has mentioned, performance will be incentivized by the HEA through additional funding or through funding consequences. So as it sets out in the task force document, the HEA block grant funding shall be linked to an institution's performance in addressing gender inequality through the strategic dialogue process and system performance framework. So this is a fairly stark incentive, or stick, as Ivana might have described it there. In addition to these equality measures, the task force has also recommended these positive action measures, and these are perceived as achieving the rapid and sustainable change that the Minister envisages. The flagship positive action measure adopted is the SALI initiative, which will create 45 women-only professorships over 3 years across Irish higher education institutions. These are new and additional positions. In other words, the posts are outside of the employment control framework. The posts are to be funded where there is clear evidence of significant gender underrepresentation, where the appointment will have a significant impact within the HEI and within that relevant faculty, and where the positions would be a proportionate and effective means to achieve accelerated and sustainable change. So proportionate is important there. Okay, so to look at some examples of positive action that have been adopted in other European higher education institutions, I suppose first of all to mention that the concept of positive action is complex, it's not necessarily agreed. There's quite a bit of conceptual confusion, which Professor Preda will talk about in a little while. So it's broadly described in the literature as a set of policies or procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination amongst a particular social group, to remedy or rectify past discrimination, and to prevent similar discrimination occurring in the future. So the notion of positive action is largely informed by the European Commission, and particularly a report that came out in 2007. And the emphasis of positive action is very much on the achievement of what's described as substantive equality or full equality in practice. In other words, going beyond the idea of equality of opportunity. So this is more focused on equality of outcome. So some of the means or the strategies that have been adopted, one would be quotas. So the HEA expert group recommended that each higher education institution introduce mandatory quotas for academic promotion based on the flexible cascade model that I've already mentioned. Now, the HEA expert group have acknowledged that gender quotas can be an emotive subject and can lead to very strong or negative reactions, and Professor Keenan will refer and discuss perhaps quotas in the electoral process shortly. A 2017 ESRI study of gender promotion in senior civil service positions in Ireland showed a decidedly negative response from men to a positive action that was introduced there by the Minister for Public Expenditure. Men perceived it as largely discriminatory in a survey conducted afterwards, while women reported that they would prefer to be promoted on merit alone. Targets. Each higher education institution is required to set ambitious, short, medium and long-term targets for both the recruitment and the promotion of academic staff. This is over and above the quotas set out as part of the flexible cascade model. Finland, Sweden and the UK have tended to favour targets rather than quotas when promoting female representation on company boards in particular. Targets are often voluntary and the findings are questionable in terms of improved outcomes for gender balance. Financial incentives for hiring women. The German federal government, in cooperation with states, implemented a women professors programme to incentivise the hiring of more female professors in higher education institutions. To qualify for the programme, HEIs had to submit gender equality plans, which would be approved by an external board. Those deemed excellent by this external board could apply for 5 years financing for up to 3 professorial posts. After 5 years, the state and/or university would take over the funding of these posts. So this sounds similar, quite similar to the SALI scheme so far. However, the recruitment associated with these professorships is advertised normally as open to males and females. So if a woman is employed as a result of the recruitment process and as a professor for the first time, the HEI can then apply to the federal government for funding for that salary for up to 5 years. Therefore eliminating some of the risks perhaps around the scheme. Gender-specific competitions. The Dutch Roskilde Franklin Fellowships grant female researchers placements for up to 6 years, following which candidates are invited to apply for tenure track positions. This programme has the stated aim of encouraging women who have a PhD to work towards a career in a top EU research institution. So this is more promoting the equality of opportunity approach. The PRIMA programme in Switzerland awards grants to female researchers to lead their own research project at Swiss HEIs, and we see a number of those kind of programmes around Europe where again the focus is on funding towards research rather than positions within universities. They're deemed to accelerate the opportunity structure. Enterprise Ireland have some startup funds for female entrepreneurs, female-led startups and so on. There are also some sectors that are imbalanced in gender but in the opposite direction. So, for example, in Coventry, a bursary was introduced in 2017 to encourage men to become involved in healthcare courses and nursing and so on. These are primarily at undergraduate level, at student level. So the final one, gender-specific positions. The Max Planck Institute in Berlin launched the Lisa Meitner Excellence Programme, a women-only programme of tenure track positions in 2017. Again, looking at the lack of female representation at director level. The Technical University of Delft offered 5-year women-only fellowships at assistant, associate, full professor levels. Fellowships came with research funding, a deliberate strategy to help fellows to establish their own research programme and get on the career ladder as such. This positive action was the subject of a discrimination claim to the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights. The male claimant argued that the failure to consider him as a candidate for the fellowship breached his right to equality under European law. The Institute found that the fellowships were an acceptable positive action measure to improve gender equality in practice, as envisaged by EU legislation. However, a number of grounds had to be met in order for that finding to be made, that there was a serious problem in terms of the equality measure under review. In other words, that female representation in academic posts in the Netherlands was a problem and evidence was needed to support that. That other equality measures had been tried and had failed. That the positive action policy utilised, that is gender-specific positions, actually worked, that a difference could be seen, which in this case could be proven, and that the particular policy is not disruptive to the overall recruitment practice. Again, the proportionality has to be brought to bear. The final thing I just mentioned very briefly before we finish are comments from two key, I suppose, academics that have been involved in equality and inequality for many years, Kathleen Lynch of UCD and Celine McCoy of the SRI, an adjunct professor with Department of Sociology here in Trinity. So the SRI have conducted extensive research on equality and educational inequality in particular. So Professor McCoy acknowledges that the SALI initiative as a positive action initiative, in her opinion, will achieve gender balance in higher education faster, and it may also have a positive influence in higher education in terms of visibility, role models, decision-making, mentorship, some of the issues that will be looked at by Professor Ramos. Such initiatives, she argues, can do little to address a number of fundamental issues in the wider educational system. For example, Professor McCoy argues that gender disparities are established in education long before women think about applying for professorships. Such disparities are apparent by the time students choose their senior level subjects for their leaving certs. There are various reasons cited for this, for example, boys' schools being more likely to offer STEM subjects. In addition, the Growing Up in Ireland longitudinal study has also shown an interesting finding. Boys with high maths scores are more likely to be described as above average or excellent at maths by their mother and teacher than girls with the same scores, but the same pattern is not repeated for reading scores. So gender stereotypes are already established by the age of 9. Kathleen Lynch, who I end on, in an earlier reflection on the scope of positive action, so she was involved in the early writings within Europe on the notion of positive action, argues for the need for equality of condition. So she suggests that positive action policies implicitly lend credibility to systems that remain structurally biased against those who are marginalised. This is very evident in the area of gender, where women have been incorporated into male-dominated disciplines or fields, but on traditional male terms. Women remain subordinated in higher education because the deeply patriarchal structures of its operation have not changed. So I conclude with a couple of questions. Does the current ambitious equality mission of the government do enough to subvert the patriarchal system that Lynch refers to? And can the strategy of creating new female-only professorships in the higher levels of academia address the concerns that Professor McCoy has raised around embedded stereotypes from early years education?
Thank you very much, Elaine. There was a really substantive overview. It was brilliant to get that, and you've ended with some very provocative and very timely questions. So next we'll hear from Alejandra, who's going to focus, I think, on the issue of role models and on gender representation in economics. Alejandra.
Well, good evening, everybody. As an economist, what I'm going to be doing right now is presenting a case of role models in economics, and I'm pretty much going to bombard you with data from now on, okay? So let me start just with what we think about role models. What we think about role models are individuals or agents that could inspire other agents and could act as behavioral role models. They could be a source of inspiration, and they could also be a representation of what's achievable or not. And from outside academia, we already have good evidence that role models work for empowering specifically women and girls. We have evidence from India where political gender quotas have a fantastic effect not only in political representations but also in the gender education gap, also in the aspirations of boys and girls, and the aspirations that parents have about their kids as well. We also know that the introduction of cable television in India has changed a little bit the beliefs and the aspirations of the women, in particular relating to susceptibility of violence. In Brazil, soap operas have changed completely the fertility pattern and also the type of family dynamics and the divorce rates. In Uganda, we know that children that watch a movie that presents a role model, they persistently perform better in very high stakes exams. And also when we give marginalized women some videos about what they can achieve, they perform better. So videos, gender roles work, and this is causal evidence. Why I'm going to focus in economics. Economics is what I would call a leaky pipeline. And here I'm presenting data from the US, and then I'll present some data for Ireland and also for Trinity. Here's where we are. I present data, historical data from 93, and I'm looking at the share of women. Let's start with the undergrad. Around 35% of the majors in undergrad in economics are women. That reflects a little bit as well in the PhD. The problem in the past 30 years, there has been not much improvement. It's still the 35%. First leakage when we enter in the PhD, of course, we have been doing a little bit better, and since 2009, we could say that we are doing better. The same ratio in the undergrad is transformed to the PhDs. But there is the first big fall when we enter to assistant professors. We lost a bunch of women, and we only have 30, maybe that's less, 25% of the representation. Up to 2009, we were doing a little bit better, and then we're regressing in the trend. Second and third leakage, when we go from assistant professors to associate professors, and from associate professors to full professors, we lost them all, although we have been improving over time, at least. Professor Claudia Goldwyn in Harvard, she decided to build a measure so that we can think more systematically about it. So we are building here what we call the female to male ratio, and this is a conversion rate that takes into account that in fact there are more women graduating from their undergraduate programs. What's this ratio? So here we have it historically for the US, and what we have is that for every female mayor, there are around 3 male mayors. And very sadly, we are not doing much better than in the 80s. Actually, in the 80s, it was a little bit better, and that's at the top 100 universities and all universities. How are we doing in Ireland? Here is what I present for all of the honor graduates. This is using data from the Higher Education Authority. And let me start by looking at economics. And in economics, I thought we were doing a little bit better, but up to 2013, there was almost, again, for every female economist graduated, we have 3 males. Nowadays, we're doing a little bit better. And the situation for philosophy is very similar, whereas we have the opposite situation where we're looking at sociology and political science, where we have about 2 female sociologists or political science graduate for every male, because the ratio is inverted. What about Trinity? We have been collecting some data for the Antina Swan project, and what we have find is consistent with what we have with the data of the Higher Education Authority, and is, yes, economics and philosophy, we have a lower share of female students. We are around the 43% relative to sociology and political science. Of course, this is aggregate data. This is our approach to try to recover full-time equivalent because our programs are a little bit more complex. Again, we have around 43% of female students in our programs relative to a more like 55% in other programs. What do we know about the evidence then? How can we make our female undergraduate students to be more likely to graduate in econ, or at least not to have a persistent difference? Some evidence for the US has shown that in the Air Force Academy, the students were randomly allocated to their teachers. The female students that have a female instructor are more likely to graduate in STEM. This has no negative effect, and there is no negative effect for the male students, and the women that are high performing, they do better. What about specifically about the role models? So this is a recent paper published by Catherine Porter and Danila Serra in the AJ Policy Journal, and what it is they take the first year students, and they have tutorials, like what here in Trinity. And to some of these students, they receive a 15-minute visit, one visit, of an alumni, female alumni, telling them what she does when being an economist and trying to inspire them a little bit, and that's it. Well, these students are persistently more likely to graduate as an economist. So they start taking more classes in economics, so they enroll into intermediate economics, and then they major in economics. And again, there is no effect whatsoever in our male students. So we are not hurting anyone with this policy. What happened next when we go to the graduate level and the PhD students? Here is a graph of Leah Buston, who was recently visiting us and giving as well a public lecture. And here is the share of female students between 94 and 2005 in the PhD levels, and in 2006 and 2007. Lesson for this graph, it's persistent. It is not that the departments suddenly are going to change their gender representations. And in fact, by conducting just correlation, this is not causation, but some also in-depth interviews, what we have learned from this experience is that the students, female students, report that what is meaningful for them is the share of faculty, female faculty, because they ask a source of inspiration for them. Where are we in Trinity and in the school? Again, with the limited data that we have been able to capture so far, what we know is that at the application levels for all of the master programs and all of the PhD programs that we offer in the school, we have 43% of applications of women against 57% of application of male. But conditional on receiving an application, we treat women and girls equally in the offers that we make and in the probability that they accepted. So we start here for applications, then we go to the no offers and a firm offer, and then accepted and not accepted. So, but those ratios are the same. So we have a gap at the application level that we need to target. And we already know that this gap probably is correlated with the share of female faculty that we have. What do we know? Again, causal evidence. Here I present some results for a paper of Francine Blow, and what we have been doing in economics is quite interesting. So in 1971, there was a committee for the situation, they formed a committee of the situation of women in economics, and they started to run workshops, and in particular in the workshops that they ran in 2004 and 2006, they have oversubscription. So they randomly decide who was going to participate or not in the workshop, and that was a 2-day exercise, group workshop with a female senior economist. Watch out. 5 years after, there are 3 extra publications. Maybe for other disciplines, that's not a lot, but in economics, that's a lot. And there is a 0.25% higher probability of having a publication in a top-tier journal. And this is just interim results. So these are big numbers of having this mentorship. There is, again, the problem that this is what happens with mentorship at the assistant professor positions. But we have other levels that they are still facing the gap. So what do we know for higher levels, in particularly associate and full professorships? And here having a mentor and a role model is going to be a little bit more tricky because we don't have many of those. So let's just look at the experience of Spain in where between 2002 and 2006, all of the promotions in the entire higher education system were were centrally decided, and the members of the committee were randomly selected. What we have in the evidence for Spain is that the gender composition of the committee did matter for the women that were applying for full professorships. So if we think about the size of the committee, in a committee of 7 members, an additional female member will increase the probability of success of a female applicant for a full professorship position by 14%. What happens when we look at the associate level? At the associate level, there was no difference in the gender composition of the committee. So here we are suggesting that the effect of the gender composition matters depending on which is the level that we're looking at. And if we have a scarce resources that is senior female economists, we need to be a little bit more strategic in how we allocate this resource, because guess what? This is costly. Sitting in a committee is costly. Let me show you, to end up here before going to my conclusion, some recent evidence about volunteering for low profitability tasks. So whenever you talk about it with anyone who is doing research, they will tell you that you need to prioritize your research time. You need to focus on publishing and advancing in your career. And anything that involves with service is typically not considered as a high promotability task. Well, let me start with Pittsburgh University experience. First, they did just a survey in their faculty, and everybody agreed that spending time in service was not the best thing to do for assistant professors and no one else in the department. And then they ran a lab experiment. This was with the students, but then they simulate low profitability task. And a low profitability task is a task in where everybody will benefit if it's done. No one wants to do it, so everybody wants the next person to do it. And it is not easy to move forward with it. And what they find with these lab experiments is, first of all, women are more likely to volunteer for this low profitability task. More importantly, women are more expected, or they are more likely to Yeah, when there is an external, he pretends or she pretends that women are the ones that should volunteer for this task. And conditional on being asked, guess what? They are more likely to accept and agree on the task. But if the time is limited and women cannot, or any human being has a limited stock of time, and women are more likely to spend their time in low profitability tasks, guess who are less likely to be promoted? So what I want to conclude in here is, first of all, that women representation in economics, it's problematic. We have a ceiling that we have not been able to cross. And we lost female at every steps of the ladder, and in our case, we believe that role models could help to overcome the situation. However, being a role model, we all know, can be very costly for the role model herself. So my proposal is that under the constraint and under the current representation levels, we need to be more strategic about what we're doing with our senior female economists. And in that strategicness, we need to prioritize upper levels of the ladder, because those are the ones where the marginal return of the time is their highest. Whereas we're thinking about lower levels, we could use alternative sources of role models. We already know from causal evidence that alumni work very well to inspire undergraduate students. We could also use the experience of senior female economists from other affine disciplines that do not have this gender composition problem, but also we know that we have videos, we have gender representations in the curriculum, so we have other forms that we can use so that we don't overstretch the limited resources that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandra, and for another superb presentation. Really robust evidence there, I think, and I know, like many, I was furiously taking notes, as with Elaine's presentation. We will have questions and answers at the end for all our panellists. So next, I'd ask you to welcome Lisa, who's going to talk about gender representation in politics, as you've heard, and the quota there. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Marvellous. Okay. So thank you all for coming on this horrible rainy evening. It's great to see so many people interested in gender equality. So what I'm going to talk about is a specific case of positive discrimination in Ireland, so specifically the case of the gender quota. So first of all, for those of us who are interested in studying underrepresentation in political life, we tend to sort of derive the justification for doing this going back to Hannah Pitkin, who publishes this seminal work about unpacking the concept of representation in 1967. So essentially, one of the facets of representation that she discusses is this idea of descriptive representation, which essentially is the idea that when we have representative bodies like legislatures, that we would want to have those bodies look like microcosms of society, and that essentially it's a problem when they don't look like that. Similarly, we also have this other facet, which is the substantive facet. So when we're talking about descriptive representation, we're talking about people sort of standing for members of this group. In terms of substantive representation, we're talking about people acting for members of that group. So the idea there is if women aren't in politics, then women's interests aren't going to be represented. So there is, sorry, I'm going to keep doing that. I have a sense that I'm going to keep doing that. Marvellous, there we go. So there is empirical evidence that actually women are different from men when they enter political life. So they tend to hold different views. They tend to behave differently as well. So there are some good examples about this. In the US, during the government shutdown under Barack Obama, there were sort of discussions about how the role of women in actually ending the shutdown, which we can sort of be convinced by or not, but there is good empirical evidence in this direction. For those of us then who are interested in increasing women's representation, it's obviously important to know what the problem actually is before we seek to provide a solution. So one strategy that has been adopted, which I'm going to talk about today, is quotas. And obviously this is a broad term given to a range of different initiatives. So first of all, we tend to think of quotas being about reserved seats. So if we're talking about parliaments, essentially what you have is you have a section of those seats, a certain proportion cordoned off, which need to be filled by women. Then we have legal candidate quotas, which is what we have in Ireland. In this instance, what you have is you have a certain proportion of candidates need to be fielded by political parties, and those candidates need to be women or in fact men, depending on how it's set up. And then obviously what we have is we have political party quotas, which essentially are more along the lines of targets that political parties actually have. And obviously when it's a target and it's not enforced, it is easy for parties to sort of renege on that, which is why we tend to favour things that are backed by legislation and stiff penalties. Just to say as well, in terms of reserved seats, these are more popular in developing countries, legal candidate quotas being more popular in middle income and higher income countries, and political party quotas being sort of spread out, but obviously not necessarily being as effective. Okay. So the arguments for quotas are sort of the following. So first of all, that they directly address the problem, right? The problem is that you don't have enough women, you just get some women in, right? So that solves the problem. Similarly, it shows that women are capable, right? So the idea is that you get some women into politics. If the issue is that people thought that women couldn't do well in politics, well, hopefully they'll get in and they'll do well. And if they do well, then people will be more likely to vote for them next time because they'll realise that actually women are able to do things. And also it might encourage women to put themselves forward. So essentially, a quota is going to change the political opportunity structure. So what it does is it creates space for women where there may not have been space before. And when you do that, you'll encourage women to step forward when they're interested in, say, running for office. Arguments against are obviously ones that we've sort of heard recently in Ireland, actually, in the debate before the quota was actually implemented, but just to sort of reiterate some of them. For people who are actually in favour of addressing underrepresentation, one of the things that they mention is that quotas can actually act as a ceiling, right? So if you think of the quota for women in Ireland at the moment, it's 30%, right? So once you get your 30% done as a party, that you kind of think job done, and then you don't worry about improving things in that direction. Similarly, there's always that argument about these are just quota women, they're being selected not on the basis of merit, but just on the basis of gender. There's also a kind of an argument that these may be sort of undeserving women, right? There are more deserving men out there who want to do things for society and maybe they should actually get elected. Then we also have the argument, which is sometimes a bad faith argument, but it also is something that we should engage with, which is the idea that actually gender isn't the only group that maybe deserves attention, and that maybe we should also look at other groups in particular, sort of thinking about race and ethnicity might be particularly important, something that we want to do. And then also there's this other backlash argument, which is, well, I'm in favour of increasing women's representation, but actually if we do this in this way, then what's going to happen is it's just going to annoy everyone, and say at the next election people won't vote for women at all. Okay. So in terms of the Irish case is an interesting one, right? Because we have a bunch of features which nominally should lead to high levels of women's representation, okay? We're an economically developed country. We know that levels of economic development are associated with higher levels of women in Parliament. We have a lack of voter bias. At least one of the people in this room has done some research in this area. We have a proportional electoral system, right? So PRSTV, which means that there's actually incentives for parties to run female candidates, right, to have a more diverse slate of candidates. It's not such a risk as, say, it would be in a first past the post system. Similarly, we have a bunch of party level features as well. So we have a multi-party system, we have parties on the left, we have small parties, and we know that those parties tend to be more hospitable towards women's candidacies. And similarly, when we talk about sort of pipeline careers into the political profession, the profession of politics, often we end up talking about things like law, right? So careers where women tended to be sort of underrepresented, but actually in Ireland, the teaching profession has been sort of the most important career in terms of providing a pipeline into Dáil Éireann, and actually women are overrepresented in that occupation. So really we should see a lot more women than we have seen before. However, this graph shows you that actually women's representation has been pretty stagnant, right? So it's not until 1992 that we get into double digits, and then actually it stagnates over the period, and it's not until the gender quota is introduced that we see this jump, this 7-point jump from just over 15% to just over 22%. So why has this representation been so poor in terms of the representation of women in Parliament? Well, there's other things that might matter, right? So if you have traditional sex role socialisation, which orients women towards the private sphere and sort of discourages them from seeking a role in public life, then that can be an explanation. Similarly, if they're in relationships with people who also have experienced traditional sex role socialization, then they're probably taking care of children and domestic chores, which means that they're already doing a second shift. So then to ask them, say, to run for a local election and then to take on a third shift is maybe a bit too much. Also, we have an electoral system which has incentives to for parties to run women, right? But also we have this situation whereby, well, you can discriminate against candidates if you want, right? So if you really don't want to vote for women, it's possible. But really what was settled on in terms of the major issue was political parties, right? And that's why the quota was introduced, because it forces political parties essentially to run women and says, that, well, the issue is with you guys because you're essentially the main pipeline into the Dáil, although obviously we do have independents, and that if parties are responsible, then if we address the problem at the party level, then women will actually get into Parliament. So this is what the Electoral Amendment Political Funding Act of 2012 does. It provides for a 30% gender quota at the 2016 election, rising to 40% 7 years after. It's phrased in gender neutral terms, so you can't run 100% men, or if you do, you'll lose half of your funding for the full parliamentary term, and obviously this is a significant barrier. But similarly, this would be the case if you ran 100% women, right? So it's gender neutral. In terms of evaluating the quota, we can see obviously the impact on numeric representation. So the number of women jumps by 7 points, right? It goes straight up over one electoral cycle. Okay. In terms of the substantive impact, we'll have to wait and see, right? There were women in Dáil Éireann who were already representing women's interests, so we're going to have to think about whether the quota itself actually did have an impact, but certainly it did get more women into Parliament. Now, how does this relate to SALI? So essentially, SALI is an initiative that is sort of the closest to reserved seats when we think about quotas in this way, okay? It's not identical for a reason I'll outline in a moment, but essentially what both of these initiatives, the gender quota and SALI, essentially say is, right, there's underrepresentation of women. This is something that's, you know, a problem, right? Identifies it as a problem that needs to be tackled, and it identifies a number of explanations for why this is an issue. And the idea essentially is that women are being filtered out at different stages of the process. So women who could run for election, for example, are not running. Women who stand are then maybe potentially not getting elected, and then actually after women get elected to Dáil Éireann, they're potentially not progressing as well. So the explanations that the HEA report came up with were kind of pointing to confidence, so not necessarily women in the profession of, or in academia, not having confidence in their abilities, but sort of a lack of confidence in the selection process generally, in the system that's going to promote them. And then also pointing to culture as well, right? So potentially an internal culture which doesn't want to promote women for whatever reason. So the central idea then is, right, well, you need to create opportunities for women, and the assumption then is that you have qualified women who can actually fulfill these posts. Again, the gender quota is phrased in gender neutral terms. SALI, although it is targeted at women, it's possible for men to apply, right? So it is phrased in gender neutral terms. But it looks more like reserved seats, right? So it looks more like there are positions just available for women, which is potentially more controversial in developed countries. But it's also potentially not as controversial, right? Because these are extra posts that are being created. So you're not reducing the opportunities for men, but you are expanding the opportunities for women by adding these posts. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Adina. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was, again, it covered a huge amount of ground in a short space, and very good to see that graph and the impact of the gender quota. And those those controversial arguments we used to meet by talking about the 5 C's as the barriers that were holding women back in politics: lack of cash, lack of childcare, lack of confidence, the old boy culture, and in politics, candidate selection procedures. So those 5 C's were our arguments which we used whenever people said, well, these are unmeritorious, they will, they don't reward on merit. We say, well, if you think politics is an equal playing field which rewards people on merit, look again at our political system. I know Gail McElroy would be very well aware from her own research on this, and anyone in political science, or anyone who's ever stood for election. And one very interesting thing for me was when we'd recommended the quota, and it was creating a lot of debate and there was a lot of controversy about it, having a closed door meeting, which I can now reveal, with the general secretaries of all the political parties, where they practically begged us to force them to implement a gender quota, because they couldn't do the voluntary ones. Because, I mean, as Lisa says, there are other countries which implement voluntary ones where you've got big political parties, usually from the left or social democratic, they have a voluntary quota, that influences the culture. Here the political parties were saying, we can't do it, we're under pressure from the men within to keep the status quo. So there you are, that was one very strong argument for quotas. Anyway, with that, without further ado, our last speaker, Adina, is going to speak about affirmative action and philosophy and principles of that. So thank you very much, Adina.
Okay, so I'm afraid going to do the typical philosopher thing, and I'm just going to make some distinctions and clarifications and raise some questions that I'm not going to answer. I hope you enjoy that. So it is, I think, important to figure out what we're talking about. If we're talking about affirmative action, we may not be talking about that here, but that's what I'm intending to talk about. Because people do, of course, have in mind very different things when they argue about it, and especially if they disagree about whether it's justified or not, they may envisage very different phenomena. So I'm just gonna, I forgot to move this, right. So I'm just going to provide here 2 very sort of widely accepted definitions in the literature. Affirmative action is seen as positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and minorities in areas of employment, education, and culture from which they have been historically excluded. Another definition describes affirmative action as any policy that aims to increase the participation of a disadvantaged social group in mainstream institutions, so a bit broader than the previous one, either through outreach, targeting the group for invitations and publicity, or preference, using group membership criteria for selecting. Now, there are, in fact, problems with these definitions, and I'm not going to go through all of them because we could be here all evening. I will highlight a couple of things, and I should disclose something, actually. I am sort of borrowing a lot of these distinctions and issues from an unpublished book by a white man, so better keep that in mind. One issue with these definitions, one possible issue, is, as we can see in the background, it seems to be the case that the intention matters for describing something as affirmative action or not, whether it's aimed at actually increasing representation. And that may not necessarily be something we want to include in the definition, because we may have a policy that is not in fact aimed at increasing representation, right? It may be aimed at combating direct discrimination, right? We might have blind CVs, for instance, and the selecting stage, but it nevertheless may result in increased participation and representation. So that may count as affirmative action, perhaps. Conversely, we may have the kind of policy that does not succeed in increasing representation, even though it aims to do so. And the question is whether that does count. Another potential problem is what counts as positive steps. Now, to cut a long story short, it does seem from a number of discussions that what really counts here is going beyond attempts to eliminate direct discrimination, right? If we're only doing that, it doesn't count as affirmative action. I've already talked about whether that can work or not. Furthermore, the question is who are the envisaged recipients. So it's been noted before that there may be certain areas where it's not women or minorities that are disadvantaged in the society as a whole who are underrepresented, right? So in nursing or teaching, it is in fact men who are underrepresented, and the question is, if we want to increase their representation in those areas, does that count as affirmative action or not? And we probably want to say that it does. So it seems that a good definition should address some of these issues. One thing that I want to highlight is what I already said, is that it does have to probably include steps that go beyond eliminating direct discrimination, right? And which many, I think, alleged such policies don't. Now I also want to talk a little bit about different types of policies, affirmative action policies, and different distinctions that can be made between them. So very often, of course, we talk about quotas. That's the most standard example of an affirmative action policy. But there are, of course, goal-based policies where the aim is to achieve a certain goal, right? So, for example, if we give extra points to candidates from minority backgrounds with the aim of increasing their representation, that's a goal-based type policy, right? And it's significant because very different individuals would be admitted under these different types of policies, right? So say you have a quota, a strict quota. If you have a quota for 20 women, let's say, and 20 applicants, you will admit all 20 applicants. But if you have a goal of 20 women, you may not admit all those 20 applicants. And incidentally, it seems to me that SALI, far from being a quota type policy, is, if anything, a goal-based policy, right? Because they make it quite clear, I mean, I don't know how it will work in practice, but they do make it quite clear that in fact they will appoint on merit. And so it might be the case at the limit that none of the women who apply will in fact be qualified for the job. It's not likely, of course, but you know, it's a possibility in principle. There is also a distinction between strong and weak type of policies, which relates to the previous one. It's a different one, but it does relate to the previous one. So it could be seen as a stronger type of policy if it increases the number of people who are selected, or it could be seen as a stronger type of policy if it is in fact harder to justify. This need not go together. This is one interesting thing. So for instance, outreach kind of policies are weak in terms of being easy to justify, right? But they may be quite strong in terms of consequences. Conversely, there may be policies that are strong in terms of justification, as in they are difficult to justify, and yet they are weak on the consequence-based view. So if it's only a small number of places, for example, that are reserved for members of minorities, right? So I think we should be open to the possibility that consequentially strong forms of affirmative action are in fact easier to justify than consequentially less powerful forms of affirmative action, which is something that gets overlooked, I think. Now, one very interesting distinction I found, which did not occur to me before, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't occurred to many of you either, and I am going to take the liberty of actually reading a passage from this book, partly because I don't want people to throw eggs at me. I want them to blame. So there is a difference or a distinction between entry-based and exit-based affirmative action policies. Of course, most of the time we talk about entry-based. SALI would be an entry-based policy where we want to select members of minority groups to certain positions. But there is a possibility of having an exit-based type of policy. And here I'm going to read this passage. The general neglect of exit-based affirmative action is striking because some core justifications for affirmative action are more congenial to affirmative action firings than affirmative action hiring. Take backward-looking justifications of affirmative action. According to such justifications, the case for firing, say, all tenured professors is stronger than the case for taking minority status into account in relation to hiring. At least this is the case if the relevant backward-looking justification implies a need for mitigating past unjust discrimination. Something which long-time tenured professors benefited more from than presently non-tenured male colleagues. Don't throw anything at me, as I said. Many would find exit-based affirmative action stronger than entry-based. This view cannot be justified by appeal to all of the standards that justify affirmative action, because on such standards it might be easier, not harder, to justify the former than the latter. I suspect one reason why nevertheless many see exit-based affirmative action as a stronger form of affirmative action is our general psychological aversion to loss. On reflection, however, this is unsustainable, and not only because loss aversion is irrational. A 63-year-old white male professor who gets fired loses out on a few years of employment prior to retiring. A 26-year-old white applicant for a tenure-track position might lose out on a life doing what he wants to do. Admittedly, the former is likely to lose something that he reasonably thought it was quite unlikely he would lose, whereas the latter is quite likely to lose out on something that he did not, or at least could not reasonably expect he would get. But this difference in expectations is in large part the result of the fact that affirmative action is rarely exit-focused and thus cannot be appealed to in a defense of a preference for entry over exit-based affirmative action. Oh gosh, okay. So apparently I'm running out of time, which I didn't quite realize. Sorry about that. So I'm going to skip this and just mention again some similar issues and questions might come up when it comes to justifications of affirmative action, right? We need to first ask what the relevant baseline is, to which we often assume is the status quo, right? But we might need to be thinking of an alternative baseline, one where we would take other types of measures and perhaps where we would have a more distributively just society, right? So where we've already implemented just policies in terms of paternity leave and so on and so forth, and not the current one that we have. And we might want to be thinking, of course, whether we're justifying a certain policy instrumentally or non-instrumentally, right? Many people think there is something wrong with affirmative action in itself, whereas the alternative arguments appeal to kind of instrumental justifications, right, where they look what they could achieve in terms of other goals. But really what I would like people to take from this slide, is that one is that, given all I've said so far, or all I should have said so far, if I had timed myself properly, is that it's not very productive, not very fruitful to discuss justifications of affirmative action in general, but rather we need to focus on different types of affirmative actions and perhaps even specific policies. And not every kind of argument or justification will apply across the board to all of those. So that's one thing. And I had some thoughts about SALI. Well, more questions than thoughts about SALI, because it wasn't, in fact, clear to me what kind of action, if at all, an affirmative kind action type policy SALI is, right? So as I said, it doesn't seem to me like it's a quota type action. It's not clear to me what it aims at combating. I mean, some of the passages in the document I read seem to suggest that it is in fact aimed at combating direct discrimination, if that is one of the reasons why women haven't been promoted to senior posts in higher education. There may be, of course, other reasons. And it's also not clear to me how success will be measured, because, I mean, we might succeed in actually appointing all the 45 women. One of the questions is that where we want to stop? Is that going to be the end of it? What's going to happen, afterwards? Do we have anything in place to make sure that this is a sustainable kind of thing? Or, and whether it does, in fact, maybe, as actually Lisa pointed out as well, might detract from other, I think, worthwhile initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adina, for raising those very pointed and very important questions. As a mere lawyer, I did quail slightly at the prospect of exit-based affirmative action. I think that might give rise to a number of legal issues. But the philosophical and ethical questions are very interesting. So we've got 20 minutes for questions or discussion. So what I was going to do is maybe take a few people from the floor and then come back to the panel, if that's okay. And maybe you might say your name before you ask or make your comment. So feel free. This is the moment where sometimes there's a real lack of people coming forward, lack of confidence perhaps from the floor. But so any questions, please put up your hand. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, and there's a mic going around. Because it's being podcast, there is a mic going around. So Raquel has a mic. And can I just thank Raquel very much for all the work you did putting tonight together. Any questions or comments? Anyone want to kick us off?
I have a question.
Well, thank you, Adina. Yes. Excellent.
For Alejandra. Hold on. I was wondering if there might be any sort of, so to speak, decreasing marginal utility in terms of the role models. So is there any evidence to suggest that perhaps the more women there are, the less you need role models or something along those lines?
So right now, I don't think we have the evidence. If we think from a modeling perspective, which it's as economists we can bring to the table, of course, the marginal, if we think that it's a problem of representation, so bear with me, I'm going to try to transform my economic thinking into... So let's suppose that agents, like everybody's equally capable of doing everything. And we are risk averse, so we don't... And there is uncertainty whether an individual will be good or bad for a task. If we don't have a model of having a representation will help us to make more accurate decisions. So when we increase the share of women in the table, then the mismatch in what's the accurate probability and my belief is going to be reduced. So the value of our models is going to decrease over time. But I cannot say whether that decrease is going to be monotonic over time. I would say that we need more evidence for that. But in principle, yes, it would decrease the value in the long term.
Can I just say this? I think political science research, Lisa or Gail may be aware of that. If you reach 30% in women in representation levels of women in politics, it becomes self-perpetuating. You have a critical mass. So, for example, I think in Denmark they withdrew the quota because it was no longer necessary, because women were coming through anyway. The barriers had been overcome, and there was a critical mass, and you'd created enough role models and so on. So it then became you'd fulfilled the goal, and you no longer needed the quota. There was a sunset clause on the quota.
Can I add one thing then in that dimension? Because economics shows exactly the opposite. We have 20 years ago, we reached that 30% and we are still there. We have not been able to overcome. So that means that the context also matters, and the type of policies that we use to complement it are going to be key. But this is, of course, academia, which is, it's different.
Oh, those pesky economics. Oh, yes. I was interested actually in your graph, Alejandra, where there were drops, that there had been rises and then falling off of women's representation. So clearly that it wasn't a steady graph upwards either.
And just as a minor comment, I think we are all trying to understand what happened in 2010 and why is it that the representation of especially assistant professors have decreased, and understanding how those markets work. But again, I think there is worth it to understand that gap.
Gail, do you want to...
Actually, a question from your legal background. Do you know, thinking abstracting...
Is the mic... Sorry, Gail, do you have the mic?
A question for you, Ivana. Do you think the SALI positions, once they're announced, we're hoping in the next week or two, that they'll be challenged in the courts, and has the legislation been kind of proofed against a successful case?
I'm told the Attorney General has proofed the concept, and that, and I think Elaine referred to EU law on this. Clearly, we couldn't have reserved seats, for example, against EU law, but there is precedent allowing us to create these tailored positions. And I have to say, I took advice on this from my colleague Des Ryan, who'll be well known to many of you, who's an employment lawyer and who views them as robust. I'm sure they may well be challenged, but I think they'll withstand the challenge, is the short answer to that. And I should say that the gender quota law, of course, was also challenged, but has been upheld in the courts. So that's also an important point to say, that it was controversial, it was challenged. The courts upheld the quota against the challenge and said that there's no right to be selected by a political party, and that the state was entitled to, and there was no right to receive political funding from the state, and that the state was therefore entitled to tailor funding and to decide on withholding funding where parties didn't meet the quota. There's a great quote from a former Labour colleague of mine, by the way, who says that all her life she'd voted for a mediocre man, and once the quotas were in, she looked forward to being able to vote for a mediocre woman. Yes, at the back.
Hi, I'm Paul O'Grady from Philosophy. So starting off, I think the SALI experiment is a good thing, and it'll be good to see what emerges from it and how it goes. But I was struck by a kind of a congruence between what Elaine was saying and Adina was saying. So Elaine, as you quoted Kathleen Lynch, there was the worry that in some ways that the new appointees could go into a system that itself is a patriarchal kind of a system, and that it may not impact on things so much. And Adina, your final point on the slide was, could this possibly be a way of not doing other things that are kind of significant? So I was just wondering about unpacking the Kathleen Lynch quote a bit more. Elaine, could you say a bit more about why you picked that, or what was the resonance in it, or what you think might be more to be said about that?
Thank you, Elaine. And maybe Adina also.
So, I suppose I've followed Kathleen Lynch's writings on equality over the years and was curious about what would she have to say on something like positive action initiatives, only to discover that she was one of the main signatories to the early philosophy and writing around positive action in Europe countries. So the European approach is quite different to the American approach to affirmative action. Affirmative action in the US is, as we're increasingly seeing, being tested on time-limited grounds. So increasingly states are trying to roll back, in that those who are marginalised have now caught up, or they've had their injustices validated in whatever way. So I guess in Ireland, because this is rather novel, there are certain aspects such as disability, the 3% that all public bodies are to ensure are provided for is rather non-controversial. While something like this, one would have anticipated perhaps a bit more pushback. And, the level of public commentary has been rather mute. There hasn't been very controversial commentary, at least in public. So what is going on in the background, I can't comment on. So with the Kathleen Lynch, when she talks about the patriarchal system and whatever, I suppose this, would have been her long-standing criticism of equality measures, that they did not substantively tackle the structural imbalances and obstacles that those who are disadvantaged encounter. To me, the SALI initiative may or may not make a substantive mark on that. I think what is far more substantive is the threat to funding. And I think institutions are paying very close attention to that. And I never quite understood what all the fuss about Athena Swan was until I started looking into this. There is a decided risk to the HEA block grant funding. It is not to research funding, it is not to some kind of additional funding, it is to core funding. And if the state carries out what it is threatening, higher education institutions are in trouble. And I think what we've seen in recent times in our own university, we suddenly have a new person who is going to be looking after our equality and diversity issues and whatever. And I think Trinity is realising that it needs to pay attention quite quickly. So the SALI, I think, will make a difference but it may be confined. But I think some of these, if the state is willing to follow through on what it's threatening, it's a significant potential change.
Adina, did you want to say?
Well, I had so many concerns that I can't even summarize them clearly. One thing I should mention that is not at all philosophical. It didn't escape my notice that in the figures provided together with SALI, there is one area where women are overrepresented quite seriously, and that's for temporary and part-time academic staff, right? 61% compared to 39% of men. I can't help but wonder why. Would it have to do with something with the rest of the policies, such as lack of childcare and so on? So one of the concerns that occurs to me about SALI is that we might just end up sort of solving one problem, that is the lack of women at higher levels, and create another, maybe create an underrepresentation at middle levels or whatever, because I can't imagine where the women will come from, right? In my mind, the most likely scenario is that there will be women who are already in posts and will deserve to be promoted anyway, and that's what's going to happen, and we will then have the same problem at other levels, perhaps. But what do I know?
Okay, does anyone want to come in on that or any other point? Anyone? Somebody at the back, yeah?
Just a question maybe for Alejandra. We saw the data that there were, I think, 55% students in economics, and it was the opposite for political science and sociology, right? So it was half men there. Are we aiming to equalize all of these disciplines at 50%, or are we happy with discrepancies there?
I didn't catch your name, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm Thomas from political science.
So let me make first a disclaimer about the data. This is not individual level data, and we have to make some assumptions about it. So we have to make some assumptions about the percentage of the students that are in each of the programs. In principle, if we assume that women and men have equal preferences for each of the subjects, yes, we should have the 50%. That's something to be tested, but just anecdotally, when I look at my first year classes when teaching statistics, I have 50-50. I have 50% of my female students in that class. And then when I go to my third year class, I have I'm teaching mathematical economics in the third year. And then I have maybe 30%. And when I get to my fourth year class, I have 1 out of 20, which is here. So that tells you a lot of it. So yes, I would like to have the 50-50, but in order to do that, and that's also part of my message, we need data. We need good data, individual level data, so that we can follow, and then we can understand where is it that we're losing the students, and to understand whether it's a matter of preference, so that women and men want different things, or it's just an issue of the discrimination within the system.
Would anyone else like to comment from the different disciplines, political science or?
Sure. I mean, so sorry. Well, like, just to say that preferences aren't neutral, they don't arise from just anywhere. So if we're talking about why they might have different preferences, it is possible to say men and women want different things, but I think it would be slightly problematic to just kind of maybe go down the road of saying, well, men are just interested in business and economics and women just like, health and childcare, right? So we need to be cautious about that as well, because what it suggests, in fact, is that actually interventions when you get to university are much too late, and what we need to be doing is we need to be having interventions when kids are like preschool, and actually worry about what's happening then, because actually these gender roles get encoded then, and by the time they get into second level, it's much too late, because then you already are oriented towards a particular way of being, and then what you have is a maths teacher who is sort of suggesting that girls don't go and do honours maths, for example, which does happen, and then by the time they get to college, it's too late to tell them they should be doing econometrics because they don't think they can. So.
And I think we have super good evidence showing that, again, it's not that women and men have different preferences. So there is systematic evidence showing that that's not the case. Of course, for Trinity, I don't know. But around the world, we have that data.
Elaine, could I just ask you just to pick up on something Adina said, which was that issue about if you have senior women going for positions, does that leave a gap in the middle? I think you said something about which was new to me, the flexible cascade model. Mm-hmm. Does that address that issue where you try to move up from within the ranks below? Is that right? Am I right in understanding that? There's a problem, but certainly in the legal profession, there's been a certain perception that there's been many more women, very much welcome, many more women appointed to the judiciary. You may have seen announcements even this week on that, as a result of which we have very low levels of women at senior counsel level at the bar on an ongoing basis, because much fewer women go for senior counsel, and because judiciary are primarily taken from the senior counsel ranks, you have this ongoing issue where you have low levels of women at senior counsel, which is the senior practicing rank in the bar. And even as the numbers in the judiciary are now up to 1/3 of the judiciary, which is actually very good as a common law country. So I just wonder, can you say something about that? Is that a real concern?
No.
Good. Good. That's the answer I wanted to hear, but why not?
No, I don't think that should be a concern. I think the HEA had already brought in that protocol around trying to encourage proportional promotion and recruitment. So that they were trying to encourage greater equality in proceeding in those recruitment practices. However, I don't see that as an issue around these positions will be advertised publicly. It could be international candidates. These candidates will come from all over the world. I don't think it's a concern that some will be stolen from other areas or any of that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's a good clarification. Have we any other? Oh, yes, somebody else on the floor. Yeah, and somebody behind, I think.
Thanks, everybody, for a great talk. So I was very interested in what you were saying, Elaine, about kind of the second shift, and that being one of the major constraints. I think in particular that's why we see a lot more women in part-time, temporary kind of positions in academia. So, I mean, one of my concerns about SALI is that this kind of ticks a very big box in that, okay, now we've got lots more female senior academics, but it doesn't solve the systemic problem. So perhaps this is a question for Ivana, just to see, is there an appetite for other types of policies and initiatives that will remove these constraints for women? So just paternity leave, better childcare arrangements, and this is kind of one of the bigger concerns I would have about SALI over any of them.
Okay. Did anyone else have a question? And we might just finish then on that before we go back to that. No? Well, that's a good one to finish on, I think, and maybe I'll ask everyone to comment on that. For myself, just to say that certainly when we recommended the quotas, we saw it very much as part of a package of measures that would be needed to bring women forward, because clearly, we need to recruit more women to enter politics in the first place in order to be able to select women as candidates and to support them then in staying in politics. And I should say I'm the longest serving woman in the Shannon. There are many more longer serving men than me. Women tend to have shorter political careers. That's also something that probably deserves further study. But the other measures certainly that are necessary include things like childcare supports, but also just the sort of advocacy, the role model points. If you can't see it, you can't be it. So the visibility of women. We've had since 2016, it's been really visible, that increase of women in the Dáil. We've got a women's caucus now established for the first time, an initiative of some of the new women, some of whom proudly describe themselves as quota women, by the way, which is really interesting to me that we've now reclaimed that language. I've been on platforms with women TDs who said, I am a quota woman. I wouldn't be here except that my party had to operate a quota. So there's a greater clarity about that, I think. So we've had a women's caucus that's been really good at just giving support from within. We've had a big programme to commemorate the centenary of women's suffrage, Vote All 100. So you need a lot of things like that. But I mean, you also need the state measures around paternity leave and so on, I think. So I might ask each of you to comment on that. What else can be done apart from SALI? And could I, this is for a personal reason, if you had to justify SALI on the media, what would be a one-line argument you would use to just... Elaine, I'm going to start with you, if I may. So first, that question about other things that can be done, and secondly, what's the biggest argument in favour of SALI? Or would you like me to start with Adina?
No, I suppose the obvious benefit of SALI is that it is going to increase the number of females in senior positions in higher education institutions in Ireland. And I think by having what is a very public campaign, what is supposed to be a very public campaign, can I just temper that again by saying it's still quite muted in terms of public discourse, that it does raise the prospect of women in academia needing further attention.
Thank you.
So in terms of policies, it seems to be that, especially for Europe, we need to complement all of these affirmative action policies with childcare policies. That's number one binding constraint that women face, and family arrangement contracts are not flexible enough. And I think in particular in the case of Ireland, the cost of childcare is simply unacceptable. Then in terms of SALI, from an economic point of view, I think given the sources of funding that it comes with, it should be a Pareto improvement. We are improving the situation of everybody in the education without hurting anyone in it. So it's sustainable from that point of view.
Okay, thank you. Lisa?
Okay, so I don't have a soundbite justifying SALI.
I'm sorry. Soundbite, but that's really what I was looking for.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm sort of allergic to sound bites. But I guess I would say that there is good empirical evidence that when women get into positions, whether it's in politics or just in business or whatever, I mean, the idea of this critical mass theory, where the 30% comes from business research, right? So it's actually that, well, when people who are in the minority get to a critical mass, which is in around 30%, they actually transform the culture. If we think there's a problem with the culture in academia, and that is caused by there being sort of fewer women, then this is something that we should do. If you don't think it's a problem, then, I mean, you don't think it's a problem, right? So, I mean, that's the sort of problem here, right, that some people just don't care. On the kind of the second shift argument, I am fully in favour of policies to support childcare and these kinds of initiatives, but I also have to say that a lot of this stuff is stuff that happens at home behind closed doors. So when we talk about the cost of childcare, well, the children didn't appear by themselves, right? So there's presumably a partner at some stage who also should have responsibility for the childcare. Similarly, for people who live in a shared household, I mean, why is potentially the woman doing all of the household labour? So in addition to policies that are going to support women, in terms of childcare, in terms of getting into these kinds of positions, I think also women need to have difficult conversations with their spouses around the amount of work they're actually doing around their kids and around the house. And I think if feminism has taught us anything, it's that the personal is political, right? So these things also need to happen at home.
Pretty good. It was nearly a soundbite. It was very good.
Thank you. So for me, one positive aspect of SALI is that it sends a signal, right? It's more the symbolic message that it sends, I think, which is the commitment to improving the situation in higher education, regardless of what it actually achieves. However, as a political philosopher interested in distributive justice generally, and gender equity, of course, as part of that, my main concern would be with the women in other sectors and the ones that are disadvantaged in society more generally, rather than breaking the glass ceiling once again. So I would be a lot more interested in other types of policies. And can I respond to Lisa, if I may? I mean, I don't have children myself, but I've heard from various friends what happened when they had children. They had that conversation prior to having them, and they were committed feminists and decided to share the burden equally. And then what happened? The male partner only got 2 weeks leave. And once he had to go back to work.
He was lucky if he got 2 weeks, by the way.
Oh, right, okay. Well, it was probably, he was an academic, the one who was telling me this story, so it may not have been a whole 2 weeks, but took a couple of days off. But once the 2 weeks were over, they just fell into traditional gender roles because there was no other realistic choice, right? And so all their ideals kind of went out the window. So that, yeah.
Can I
Thanks.
just respond? Sorry. So just with a very brief anecdote. So there was, so I was at a meeting about this type of issue. One of the women in the room was talking about a colleague of hers who had gone off to have a baby. The husband was also an academic. He got a sabbatical. She was off on maternity leave. He got 3 papers written, and she was minding the baby. So they both had a lot of time off. And, you know, I'm sure they had those conversations, but for some reason that didn't happen. So I think, you know, what policy would be put in place to address that situation? It's something that needs to be dealt with at home as well.
Here, here. And could I just say that, because I was that woman, no, I wasn't that woman, but I've certainly been in that position of going off to have a baby. And by the way, even the language we all use is itself, you know, you're having time off to have a baby. No, I'm not having time off. I'm having maternity leave. But I think what you've just been saying there shows the need for other imaginative policies, like the returner support that we're seeing rolled out across other academic institutions. And I think it's just been, now being mooted here in Trinity, but certainly I hope will come about as part of Athena Swan. An extra research leave period for women returning from maternity leave, or indeed anyone returning from family leave. So I think that's something we should promote within college. And I should say, in terms of other policies, of course, we have a very well-established positive action programme embedded in college, which is superb, which is the Trinity Access Programme, which targets class, specifically class discrimination. So I think, you know, when we look at precedents, we should remember there's precedents elsewhere in our student recruitment also. Anyway, with those few remarks, I just want, on all of your behalf, to thank our wonderful panel, to thank the School of Social Science and Philosophy in particular for organising this really interesting, really stimulating evening. Elaine has pointed out there's been the discourse around the SALI initiative has been far too muted. I mean, I do think we really need to get a message out there so that we can discuss all the concerns people may have, or the issues they have, or ways in which the model can be improved upon, and what we want to see out of it. I mean, these are all very important issues. So I very much hope that the school will be disseminating the talks from tonight and the information about tonight, and I hope we'll see other initiatives like this coming out of Athena Swan as well. I want to thank Raquel and Stephanie and everyone who was involved in organising the event, and just to thank again our brilliant speakers, and to hope that we'll see their work published now. As it'd be great to see a collection done on SALI to inform all of us and to inform policymakers and members of the public and all of us about the importance of promoting gender equality in this sort of way. So thank you very much.